Venezuela's deposed leader, Nicolas Maduro, has been taken to the United States after being seized in Caracas during a surprise U.S. military operation. Maduro is now in a New York jail facing criminal charges, including weapons trafficking and charges of narco-terrorism. He and his wife, Cilia Flores, were seized during an overnight raid by U.S. forces that capped months of military pressure on Maduro and his government. In the aftermath of the operation, President Trump said the U.S. will run Venezuela for the foreseeable future, but he gave few details on what exactly that might mean. Lots to talk about, and we're joined now by Mariano Aguirre Ernst. He's an associate fellow with the International Security Program at Chatham House, and he's advisor to the German Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in Madrid. Good to have you with us. Let me start, first of all, with the question of the legality of the US military action, because there's been a lot of talk about adhering to international law and international, the UN Charter on international law. So is there any argument that would legitimize what we've witnessed yesterday?
Well, the short answer is no. As a matter of fact, by international law, and particularly under the UN Charter that was written and agreed by several countries at the end of the World War II, I mean, the countries should refrain, the states, the member of the international system should refrain not to interfere in the domestic issues of other states, and at the same time should refrain particularly not to use military force in any kind of interference. This is the first issue to be mentioned. Second, of course, there are two exceptions. The first exception, if you have a threat to international peace, and we cannot really say that Venezuela has been or is a threat to international peace, neither to the regional peace in Latin America or in the relationship between Latin America and the United States. And another exception to the UN Charter, another condition could be that a country and a state find that there is a possibility of an imminent attack against him. And in this particular case, again, Venezuela has not been, and it's not, any kind of threat to the United States. Now, let me tell you that what the US has constructed has been a kind of legal argument, saying that Maduro is the leader of a cartel there is no any proof that the cartel of the Soles is existed at all, and that is a threat that there is an overlap of Maduro as the leader of a cartel, a big cartel that is overlapped with the state, and then Venezuela is a narco state that is attacking every day through exporting illegally drugs, particularly fentanyl, to the US. But fentanyl is going through the Pacific Ocean and is going through Mexico. So there is no argument for justifying this regime change action by the US in Venezuela.
So if that's the case, what signal does Donald Trump's military action then send to the rest of the world, and in particular to other big powers, namely Russia and China?
Well, the view of the Donald Trump's view of the world is what in the international relations is called the big power competition. He is imagining a world in which there are two or three big powers, let's say the US, China, and Russia, and they can really cut a deal, divide the world, divide the areas of influence, and that he is the big boss, the big leader of an area that they call, and it's a tradition in US foreign policy from the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, what they call their influence and the control of the hemispheric. Now, for Trump, the hemispheric is from Greenland to Patagonia, and they want to have a full control. This is what the new U.S. national security strategy that has been published on last November. They say that they want to control resources, particularly minerals. They want to control government, that they could be allies, particularly far-right governments, like, for example, Javier Milei in Argentina, and that they want to have access to all the sea lanes, and that what they want, and this is extremely important, is to deter migration. So the countries in Latin America or in Canada will help to deter migrants, and that they accept, on the other hand, deportees. So it's a full plan. Of course, this is a full plan. Now, the reality could be completely different because there are so many states, so many governments, so many trends, tendencies, and dynamics that will not be so easy to do.
And when you say that this is the full plan, of course, another question would be whether it ends with Venezuela. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio already has been hinting that Cuba could be next. And then, of course, for months now, there was talk about Greenland. So is this just the beginning?
Well, it's difficult to say in the mind of Donald Trump what he wants, but in the mind of Marco Rubio, because of his, I would say, his roots, he's from a Cuban family that exiled in the United States, is for Rubio there is a kind of domino theory in which first we have Caracas, where we have Venezuela, then we have Cuba, then we have Nicaragua. So these three countries, I think, that are on the verge of they should be worried and concerned about it. Of course, in Cuba and in Nicaragua, we have very authoritarian governments, but to have authoritarian governments is not an excuse to intervene in their internal affairs. Otherwise, if you want to intervene to regime change, for example, for democracy, then we will have a world really in full war with a series of consequential interventions.
Now, we heard from our correspondent earlier from Washington that many people in the United States are wondering how this attack fits in with Trump's America First doctrine, and also how it may fit in with his claim that he's the big peacemaker bringing peace to the world. Isn't there a major contradiction there?
There are two things in your question. The first one is that, as you know, and the audience knows, the MAGA movement, the Make America Great Again, is a movement which is a mix of social movements, grassroots, the constituency, the electoral movement of Mr. Donald Trump, and also the Congress, the Republicans in Congress. And Make America Great Again, the ideologists, like, for example, Steve Bannon, they want to expand Make America Great Again to the world. And particularly, there are two areas. One is Latin America, and the other one is Europe. So they want to promote far-right governments. They want to have allies in these two regions. And they want, as Donald Trump said in the press conference yesterday, they want now Venezuela make great again, and tomorrow will be other countries. So yes, they want to expand ideologically this far-right movement, which is a kind of right-wing Christian, authoritarian, anti-democratic movement. On the other hand, the possibilities, I would say, that this could happen, again, I must say, are not easy. But of course, it's mixed with the theory or the action with regime change that we just explained the first question.
Right. Mariano Aguirre Ernst there, an associate fellow with Chatham House and advisor of the German Friedrich-Ebert Foundation in Madrid. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Mark Montgomery is a retired Rear Admiral and senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He joins me now. So the arrest of Maduro is being seen by some as a successful decapitation strike. Now, at the same time, we also saw little, if any, resistance from Venezuela's military. Did that surprise you?
The lack of resistance didn't surprise me, only in the sense that this was the natural culmination of a maximum pressure campaign. In other words, the Venezuelan military had the last 3 months to observe what the U.S. was building up, what the U.S. was capable of doing. There was a clandestine strike on December 24th, 25th on one of their ports. I think they understood the disproportionate force structure. So, but nonetheless, that was an aggressive strike last night. You know, they had to carve a hole through air defense systems so the helicopters could get in safely. And even then, there was still some fire at the helicopters. And then they intentionally struck intelligence and military centers. And they did this because part of it was, to allow the helicopters to get in. But the second one was a signal to the Venezuelan military going forward This is not a fight you want to take up. And so I assume that's why there was such an aggressive strike platform alongside the capture mission.
So I think the key word right there is going forward. What comes next? What are the next key steps for Washington?
Look, he's never been an advocate of regime change. I mean, what he said today was contrary to almost every indication he's given from his last 2 years of his first term and all the way, all the past year of this term. But that's what he has his hands on now. He has his hands on a regime change situation. And unlike the Fordow strikes in Iran, where Trump did the action he wanted and then said, okay, fight's over. He doesn't have that luxury here in Venezuela. He's now going to have to stay engaged. I don't believe we can, as he would say, quote, run the country externally. But we do have to make sure that Maduro's cronies, I would include the vice president, but more specifically, the Minister of Defense and the Interior Justice Minister, those two are the real runners of of what President Trump had labeled a foreign terrorist organization, a narco cartel. Those two need to be pushed out of power, and they need to be convinced that they can go peacefully in a flight to Cuba, or they can stay and fight and get at best the same result as Maduro, at worst being killed.
Well, as you were saying there, Trump may not have been a fan of regime change, but he definitely has that situation on his hands right now. And it's not the United States' only experience with regime change in living memory. Of course, I'm thinking of Iraq and Afghanistan here. So are there any lessons from those conflicts that can be learned in the current situation?
Well, and I can think of in my military career, Panama, Haiti, and Grenada, 3 other places where we've done it. And in none of the 5 do I think it went successful. Panama went all right. Part of Panama was that there was a compliant military ready to take over. And that's one of the unique situations here is compared to almost every other country in South America. Right now, normally the United States, there would be several hundred generals and colonels of the Venezuelan military that went to school at American war colleges and West Point and places like that and have relationships. But we cut that off 30 years or 25 years ago now in Venezuela. So we don't have those relationships. So this is going to be very hard. And so those lessons that we learned in Iraq and in Afghanistan are going to have to be learned without having good relationships on the ground. And the president didn't sound like he had heard many of those lessons learned, because the idea of running the country for some period of time is not realistic, given his desire to not put U.S. boots on the ground.
Now, as you were saying there, we don't really have any relationships or direct relationships with Maduro's government, and his government is still ostensibly intact. Do you see any sign that they will be willing to work with the United States in any quote-unquote transition of power?
So far, no. And her, I think the vice president's press conference, as compared to her reputed phone call with Rubio, the difference between those 2 descriptions tells you that she understands that eventually, if she and the other cronies, as I said, the Minister of Defense and the Minister of Interior, don't leave the country, then they're going to have to stay and fight, because there is not a world in which they get to run the country going forward. And it's not like Maria Machado, the opposition, the duly elected opposition for the 2024 stolen elections.
So where does that actually leave us? I mean, we're in an unclear situation in terms of who is actually running the country. Trump said the United States will run Venezuela, but is that even possible without a direct military or administrative presence in the country?
So no, and I think the right answer was Trump's answer during his Fox call, his call into Fox TV, and in his Truth Social post, where he said, "I warn you, other cronies, leave now or face the same kind of punishment." That's the right answer. The right answer is to threaten the other members of the leadership structure to leave the country so that the duly elected opposition can step in. I think the military, having experienced what they did last night, will willingly stand down and hope that they can carry through. But the actual inner circle of Maduro's has to leave. The president said that right 12 hours or 24 hours ago. He did not say that right at the press conference 10 hours ago.
Now, many European leaders have criticized Trump's unilateral action as illegal. Do you share any of those concerns?
So in this whole pressure campaign, I think there's been some inappropriate military activity. The striking of the ships, of the drug ships without properly doing law enforcement. The second strike on shipwreck survivors. Those were illegal. Ironically, these are not. He has declared Maduro's regime a foreign terrorist organization. They're not the duly elected regime of the country. He said they were a national security threat to the United States. These are all the legal things he needed to say so that the United States could take action. I think some of the European criticism is that it's Trump, which is understandable, but not appropriate. I mean, I think what he's doing here is legal in the United States system. He has a certain number of days, to get support from Congress or to desist in these operations, but that's like 3 months away. So he can continue these operations legally. I don't think he really cares what the Europeans think. And in that sense, I do agree with him that the Europeans would probably have a different approach to this if it was Barack Obama or Joe Biden doing this, and they just have an antipathy towards President Trump, which he may have earned.
And of course, EU leaders are not the only countries watching what's going on in Latin America. Countries like China and Russia will be watching these events quite closely as well. So what kind of message exactly do you think this military action is sending countries like China and Russia?
So this is a very mixed message. On the one hand, to a country like China that feels it should be able to operate unilaterally against Taiwan, or Russia who feels they can operate unilaterally against Ukraine, they might see this as some justification. That's kind of theoretical. On the practical level, it's, hey, this is the second time Trump has done something that we did not think an American president would do. The first time being the B-2 strikes on Fordow in Iran. And so, if you're China and you've tired of strategic ambiguity, probably, which has been the U.S. policy, I think this kind of strategic uncertainty that you're getting from Trump is probably even more gives you more cause for pause. So, and weirdly, this could have a deterrent effect on how China sees Taiwan. I think Russia's already into the Ukraine game, so at this point, it's somewhat irrelevant.
All right, that was Mark Montgomery, retired Rear Admiral and Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.